A gunshot echoes through the canyon. 5 men, 1 victim, and on the ridge above them, a single witness. One flash of light, one fatal mistake, and suddenly, the hunter becomes the hunted. Now, with killers on their trail and the unforgiving wilderness closing in, every step could be their last. This isn't just a story, it's a fight for survival against impossible odds. This story proves that courage is not about being fearless, it's about moving forward even when fear is right behind you. It shows us that loyalty, trust, and determination can overcome even the harshest challenges. If you enjoyed this journey, hit like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to stay with us for more powerful stories.
The Utah sun didn't just shine, it hammered. It beat down on the red sandstone canyons until the air itself seemed to shimmer and bleed. Josephine Abbott ignored the sweat stinging her eyes. Her focus was entirely on the heavy brass and mahogany of her large format camera, perched precariously on its wooden tripod. Under the heavy black focusing cloth, the world was reduced to an inverted square of glass. She had come to the canyonlands seeking the raw, untouched brutality of the West, to capture it on fragile glass plates before civilization paved it over. 20 paces behind her stood her hired guide, Big Macklin. The man was less a human being and more a geological feature. Standing at 6'7", with shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, he was a silent monolith of muscle, scars, and faded canvas. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they left the trading post 3 days ago. Joe preferred it that way. She paid for his protection and his knowledge of the treacherous trails, not for his conversation. "Almost got it," Joe murmured, mostly to herself, as she adjusted the rack and pinion to bring the canyon floor below into sharp focus. But as the blur resolved into clarity, the breath hitched in her throat. Down in the dry wash, 100 yards below her vantage point, 5 riders had formed a loose circle. In the center was a man on his knees. Even upside down on her ground glass, Joe recognized the glint of a tin star pinned to the kneeling man's chest. And she recognized the man standing over him, pointing a Colt peacemaker directly at the lawman's head. Silas Blackwood, the territory's most wanted ghost. "I shouldn't," a voice screamed in her head. "Step away." But the instincts of a photographer overrode the survival instincts of a woman alone in the wild. Her fingers moved with practiced mechanical precision. She slid the glass plate holder into the back of the camera, pulled the dark slide, and grabbed her flash pan. In the deep shadows of the canyon wall, she needed light to expose the plate quickly. Below, Blackwood cocked the hammer. Joe squeezed the shutter release and simultaneously struck the spark to the magnesium powder. Whoosh! A blinding, brilliant white flash erupted on the canyon rim, instantly vaporizing the afternoon shadows. It was a sunburst of her own making, followed by a thick plume of acrid white smoke. Down in the wash, the gunshot echoed, a flat, cruel crack. But immediately after, 5 heads snapped upward, drawn by the unnatural lightning on the ridge. Through the clearing smoke, Silas Blackwood looked directly up at her. Even from this distance, Joe could feel the icy promise of death in his stare. "They saw," Joe gasped, freezing in pure terror. "Leave it." The voice was a low, gravelly rumble just behind her ear. Macklin didn't wait for her to process the danger. One massive, calloused hand clamped around her upper arm, pulling her away from the cliff edge with the effortless strength of a man lifting a child. "My camera! The plate!" Joe fought against his grip, desperately reaching back. The evidence was in the holder, the only proof of a murdered lawman. Macklin cursed softly. With his free hand, he reached out not to grab the heavy camera, but to deftly unlatch the wooden plate holder from the back of the device. He shoved the thin, fragile box into the deep pocket of his canvas duster, then scooped Joe up entirely by the waist. "Hey!" "Quiet!" he growled, setting her on her feet as they hit the narrow trail leading away from the rim. "Run!" A bullet struck the sandstone exactly where she had been standing a second before, showering her abandoned camera in red dust. The sharp crack of a Winchester rifle rolled up the canyon walls. They plunged into a slot canyon, a twisting, claustrophobic fissure in the earth. where the sky was reduced to a jagged blue ribbon 100 feet above. Jo ran until her lungs burned, her boots sliding on the loose scree. Behind them, the shouts of the Blackwood gang echoed, amplified and distorted by the twisting rock walls. They were fast. They knew the terrain. "We can't outrun horses," Jo panted, stumbling against the cold-shadowed rock. "They can't bring horses in here. Too narrow," Macklin replied, his breathing frighteningly even for a man of his size moving at such a pace. "Keep moving." Suddenly, the ground beneath their boots began to vibrate. It wasn't the pounding of boots or hooves. It was a deep, low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the bones of the earth itself. Macklin stopped dead. He looked up at the sliver of sky. It had turned the color of an angry bruise, a storm miles away, raining on hard rock. "Flash flood," Macklin said. The calmness in his voice was more terrifying than the gunfire. The rumble turned into a roar. The sound of a freight train made of churning mud, boulders, and ancient timber tearing through the narrow canyon towards them. "Here!" Macklin grabbed her shoulders and shoved her into a dark, horizontal fissure in the canyon wall, a cave entrance barely wide enough for a coyote. "I can't fit," Jo cried out, feeling the jagged stone tear at her blouse. "You will." Macklin forced himself in behind her, his massive shoulders scraping and protesting against the unforgiving stone. He pushed her deeper into the blackness just as the roar became deafening. The floodwater didn't just pass by, it exploded against the canyon walls. A violent torrent of freezing, muddy water sprayed into their narrow sanctuary. The earth violently shuddered. Above them, the vibration dislodged tons of loose rock from the canyon rim. With a sickening, thunderous crash, the entrance to the cave collapsed. The roar of the water was instantly muted, replaced by the sound of falling dust and tumbling pebbles. And then, nothing. The darkness was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Jo's eyeballs. The air instantly turned cold and smelled of wet copper and crushed stone. "Macklin?" Jo whispered. Her voice trembled, sounding small and pitiful in the void. "Don't move," he rumbled from somewhere right beside her. She felt the warmth of his massive body, the steady rise and fall of his chest against her shoulder. Jo reached out blindly, her hands scraping against solid rock in front of her, to her left, to her right. The realization crashed down on her, heavier than the rocks that had sealed them in. They were buried alive. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her throat. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick. "We're dead," Jo gasped, her chest heaving as she clawed uselessly at the darkness. "We're buried. They're going to get away with it. The photograph, it's going to rot down here with us." "Stop." Two hands, large and impossibly rough, found her shoulders in the pitch black. They didn't squeeze, they just anchored her. The sheer size of him, the steady, immovable reality of his presence in the dark, forced her frantic heart to slow its rhythm. "Listen to me, Josephine," Macklin said. His voice was no longer the grunt of a hired hand. It was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to fill the tiny cavern, carrying a strange, fierce gentleness. "I've spent my whole life breaking things," he whispered in the dark, his breath warm against her temple. "But right now, I'm going to keep something whole." He shifted his weight, pulling her slightly closer, shielding her smaller frame entirely with his own. "I will get you out of this dark. I will make sure you and that picture see the sun again." Macklin's grip on her shoulders tightened just a fraction, cementing the vow. "That is my promise, and I have never broken my word." The darkness of the collapsed cave was a living, breathing entity. It pressed against Josephine's chest, stealing the oxygen from her lungs. The silence ringing in her ears was broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of her own breathing and the slow, rhythmic exhalations of the giant man beside her. "Macklin?" Jo whispered, her voice cracking. The dust from the cave-in coated her throat like ash. "How much air do we have?" "Enough," Macklin rumbled in the pitch black. His voice was a physical vibration against the stone, calm and impossibly grounded. Feel the wall behind you. It's damp. Where there's water in sandstone, there's a way out. Jo reached back. Her raw, bleeding fingertips brushed against the cold rock. He was right. A slick, mossy film coated the stone, and beneath it a faint, almost imperceptible draft tickled her skin. It wasn't the dead air of a tomb. It was the breath of the earth. "Move back," Macklin ordered. Jo flattened herself against the curving wall of their tiny prison. In the total absence of light, her other senses heightened to a painful degree. She heard the rustle of Macklin's heavy canvas duster, the dull thud of his boots finding purchase on the uneven floor. Then she felt the sheer displacement of air as he shifted his massive bulk. A guttural, animalistic grunt tore from his throat. Crack! The sound was deafening in the confined space. Macklin was using his raw, unadulterated strength, driving his shoulder and fists into the fault line of the rock face. Dust rained down on Jo's hair. Crack! Crumble! He wasn't using tools. He was fighting the mountain bare-handed. Jo listened in terrified awe as the giant hurled his immense weight against the stone again and again. She could hear the wet tear of his skin against the jagged sandstone, the heavy, laboring heave of his lungs. He was tearing themselves a birth canal through the rock, with a final earth-shaking heave and a roar that seemed to tear from the very bottom of his soul. The rock gave way. Pale, dusty light pierced the gloom, so sudden and brilliant it felt like a physical blow to Jo's eyes. She squeezed them shut, throwing a hand over her face. Fresh, blistering hot air rushed into the cavern. "Come," Macklin rasped. He reached back, his massive hand blindly finding hers, and pulled her through the jagged opening. They spilled out onto a narrow, sun-baked ledge overlooking a vast, empty canyon. Jo fell to her knees, gasping for the dry, searing air, coughing up lungs full of red dust. When she finally opened her weeping eyes, she looked at Macklin. The right side of his canvas duster was shredded. His shoulder was a mess of scraped flesh and bruised muscle, bleeding sluggishly down his arm. But his jaw was set, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with the predatory focus of a hawk. "They'll see the cave-in," Macklin said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at his wounds. "Blackwood knows this territory. He knows the flash floods don't fill every crack. He'll look for where the water drained. They'll be on our trail before the sun hits its peak." Jo looked down at her hands. They were trembling violently. The reality of what had just happened, what was still happening, crashed over her. "My camera is gone. Everything is gone." Macklin turned to her. He reached his uninjured left hand into the deep inner pocket of his ruined duster. Slowly, carefully, he withdrew the thin wooden box containing the glass plate. "Not everything," he said quietly. Jo stared at the plate holder. It was the only thing standing between Silas Blackwood and the hangman's noose, and it was entirely in the possession of a man she barely knew. A man who looked like he could crush her skull with one hand. "Why?" Jo asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you save it? You could have run faster without me, without that." Macklin's pale eyes met hers. There was no warmth in them, but there was an immovable bedrock of resolve. "I told you, Miss Abbott. I gave you my word in the dark. Now get up. The sun is going to be a worse enemy than Blackwood's bullets today." The trek across the Utah badlands was a descent into hell. The heat radiating from the canyon floor was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders and blurring the horizon into a shimmering mirage. There was no shade, no water, only the endless expanse of red rock, twisted juniper bushes, and the merciless, hammering sun. Jo pushed herself beyond the limits of human endurance. Her boots blistered her heels, her lips cracked and bled. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Yet ahead of her, Macklin moved with a steady, unrelenting gait. He was a machine fueled by grim determination. Occasionally he would stop, easily lifting her over a treacherous rockfall or hauling her up a steep incline with one hand, before silently pressing on. By mid-afternoon, The heat stroke began to claw at the edges of Joe's sanity. Her vision swam. She stumbled, her knee slamming hard into jagged limestone. She didn't have the strength to cry out. She just lay there on the burning rock, the will to live evaporating like a drop of water on a hot stove. Get up. She felt Macklin's shadow fall over her, offering the first fleeting moment of coolness she'd felt in hours. I can't, she croaked, her tongue swollen in her mouth. Just leave me, Macklin. Take the plate. Go. Macklin didn't argue. He knelt beside her. His massive hands, covered in old scars and fresh blood from the cave, reached out. But they didn't grab her roughly. With surprising, heartbreaking gentleness, he lifted her by the waist, slinging her over his broad, uninjured shoulder like a sack of flour. Put me down, she weakly protested, hitting his back with a fist that felt like a feather. You're too heavy, you'll slow us both down. Save your breath, Macklin rumbled, adjusting her weight. I've carried heavier burdens for worse reasons. He carried her for 3 miles. 3 miles across broken, searing rock, his boots leaving heavy indentations in the dust. When the sun finally began its descent, bleeding violet and bruised orange across the sky, he found a shallow overhang. A miserable excuse for a cave, but it offered shade. He set her down gently against the cool stone. Joe watched through half-lidded eyes as Macklin methodically stripped off his ruined duster. Beneath his cotton shirt, his torso was a canvas of violence. Scars layered over scars, knife wounds, bullet grazes, and the unmistakable jagged marks of broken bones that had healed poorly. He reached into his pocket, retrieved the glass plate holder, and set it carefully on a flat rock. Then, taking his hunting knife, he cut a clean strip of fabric from the inside of his duster. Give me your hands, he commanded softly. Joe hesitated, then extended her trembling, bloodied hands. Macklin took them. His hands were easily 3 times the size of hers, the knuckles permanently swollen and misshapen with thick calluses. Yet his touch was feather-light. He uncorked his canteen, pouring a meager, precious splash of water over her torn palms, washing away the grit. Then he expertly wrapped the clean cloth around her hands, binding them tight but not painfully so. You're good at this, Joe whispered, staring at his bowed head. Macklin didn't look up. A man who bleeds for a living learns how to stop the bleeding. You were a boxer, she said. It wasn't a question. She had seen the posters in the saloon back in town, the Denver Behemoth, bare-knuckle champion. Macklin tied off the bandage. He sat back on his haunches, looking out into the gathering twilight. Boxer is a polite word for it, Miss Abbott. In the bare-knuckle rings down in the mining camps, there are no rules, no bells. You fight until the other man doesn't get up. Sometimes they never get up. He looked down at his own massive, scarred hands. These hands have killed 3 men in the ring, crushed their skulls because a crowd of drunk miners paid to see blood. I was a monster they kept in a cage, and I let them do it because I thought that's all I was built for. Violence. Joe looked at the giant. The fading light cast long, mournful shadows across his scarred face. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man carrying a guilt so heavy it threatened to crush him. You aren't that man anymore, Joe said fiercely, ignoring the pain in her throat. Macklin scoffed bitterly. The world doesn't let you wipe the blood off, Josephine. When Blackwood's men catch up to us, and they will, they won't see a changed man. They'll see the behemoth, and I'll have to become the monster again to keep you alive. Joe reached out with her bandaged hand and laid it over his massive, battered knuckles. Then be the monster, she said, her voice steady and clear in the desert silence. But be my monster. Fight for the light, Macklin, not for the crowd. Macklin stared at her hand resting on his. For the first time since she had met him, the hard, impenetrable mask of the giant cracked. A flicker of something profound and desperate passed through his pale eyes. He gently pulled his hand away and picked up the wooden plate holder. With meticulous care, he wrapped the box in the remaining thick canvas of his duster, tying it securely with a leather strap. "Get some sleep, Josephine," Macklin said, turning his back to the wind to act as a windbreak for her. "Tomorrow we reach the old telegraph station at Black Ridge. Tomorrow we finish this." The Black Ridge telegraph station was a rotting wooden corpse sitting on the edge of the badlands. It had been abandoned a decade ago when the rail line shifted north, leaving it to the mercy of the wind, the sand, and the ghosts. Joe and Macklin crested the ridge just as the sun reached its zenith, blinding and cruel. They stumbled down the scree slope, their boots kicking up plumes of red dust. "Inside," Macklin ordered, pushing the warped wooden door open. Its hinges shrieked in protest. The interior was a shadow-filled rectangle smelling of dry rot and rat droppings. But in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust, sat the prize, a brass telegraph key and an old, heavy battery bank. "Is it dead?" Macklin asked, his chest heaving as he barricaded the heavy door with a rotted oak table. Joe dropped to her knees in front of the console, blowing the dust off the brass contacts. She grabbed the wires, her bandaged hands clumsy, and scraped them against the terminals of the glass battery cells. A faint, anemic blue spark arced between them. "There's juice," Joe gasped, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her dry throat. "Barely, but it's enough to reach the federal marshal in Salt Lake. It's a dedicated line." "Send it," Macklin said. He moved to the single front window, carefully peering through the cracks in the shutters. "Tell them Blackwood murdered Sheriff Davies. Tell them we have the photographic proof. Tell them to ride like hell." Joe's fingers hovered over the brass key. Tap, 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 tap. The metallic clicking sounded impossibly loud in the dead station. She prayed the line wasn't cut down the valley. "Macklin," Joe said, keeping her rhythm steady, "we need to develop the plate. If the marshal arrives and Blackwood destroys the negative before I can fix it, it's just my word against his. I have my emergency chemicals in my satchel, but I need total darkness." Macklin pointed to a small, windowless closet in the back of the room, an old supply pantry. "In there. Do it fast." Joe grabbed her satchel and the canvas-wrapped plate from the table. Just as her hand touched the doorknob of the closet, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a Winchester rifle shattered the silence. The window shutter beside Macklin exploded in a shower of splinters. "They're here," Macklin said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its humanity, becoming something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Joe froze, looking out the broken shutter. 5 riders sat at the edge of the scrub brush 50 yards out. Silas Blackwood was in the center, a confident, lazy smile on his face as he rested a smoking rifle on his saddle pommel. "Well now, Big Macklin," Blackwood's voice carried over the hot wind, dripping with arrogant amusement. "You boys led us on a hell of a chase, but you've run out of desert and you've run out of luck. Send the girl out with the picture box and I might just let you walk away, giant." Macklin stepped away from the window. He looked at the single 6-shooter sitting on the table. It had 2 bullets left, useless against 5 men with repeating rifles. He looked at Joe. She was terrified, her eyes wide, clutching the unexposed plate to her chest like a newborn child. "Get in the closet," Macklin commanded softly. "Macklin, what are you doing?" Joe panicked, stepping toward him. "We have to hold them off. The marshal is hours away. They will burn this cabin down with us inside in 10 minutes. Macklin reached up and slowly, deliberately unbuttoned his cotton shirt. He shrugged it off, letting it fall to the dusty floor. His torso was a terrifying landscape of muscle and violence in the dim light. He looked exactly like the monster the mining camps had paid to see. He cracked his neck, a sound like a breaking branch. Then he reached down and picked up a heavy iron fireplace poker from the hearth. "I told you I would keep that picture whole," Macklin said, his pale eyes burning with a terrifying, serene fire. "Develop the plate, Josephine. Do not come out until it is done." "Macklin, no!" Joe cried, tears finally breaking through the dust on her cheeks. They have guns. They'll kill you. I'm the Denver behemoth, he smiled. A sad, brutal smile. I don't die easy. He shoved her into the dark closet and slammed the door shut. Joe was plunged into total blackness once again. But this time she didn't freeze. She dropped to the floor, her trembling hands tearing open her satchel by feel. She found her small bottles of developer and fixer. She blindly unwrapped the canvas from the wooden plate holder. Outside, she heard the heavy oak door creak as Macklin pulled away the barricade. She heard the heavy thud of his boots stepping out onto the wooden porch. "Well, I'll be damned," Blackwood laughed outside. "The giant wants to play." "Put the guns down, Silas," Macklin's voice rumbled, echoing through the thin walls of the station. "Fight me like a man." "I ain't a sporting man, Macklin. Fire!" The deafening roar of gunfire erupted. Joe screamed in the dark, covering her ears, but her hands never stopped moving. She slid the fragile glass plate from its holder and poured the developer over it in her shallow tray, counting the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3. Outside, the gunfire was chaotic, but beneath the sharp cracks of the rifles, Joe heard something worse. The wet, sickening crunch of bone breaking. The terrified scream of a man who suddenly realized he was fighting a force of nature. Macklin hadn't just stood there to be shot. He had charged. 7, 8, 9. Joe rocked back and forth in the dark, tears streaming down her face. "Please, God, let him live." Through the thin wooden walls, the sounds of battle were visceral and horrifying. Joe heard the heavy, meaty thud of fists hitting flesh with the force of a sledgehammer. She heard a horse panic and rear. She heard Blackwood screaming orders, his voice pitching up in genuine panic. "Shoot him! Shoot him in the damn head! He won't go down!" 15. 16. Joe lifted the glass plate by the edges, her fingers slipping on the chemicals, and transferred it to the fixing bath. The image was locking in. The proof was becoming permanent. A heavy body slammed against the exterior wall of the station, shaking the entire building. Joe gasped as dust rained down on her in the dark. Then, silence. The abrupt end of the violence was more terrifying than the gunfire. There were no voices, no hoofbeats, just the howling of the wind. Joe couldn't wait any longer. The plate was fixed. She shoved the dark closet door open, blinking against the dusty light of the main room. She ran to the broken door and stepped out onto the porch. The clearing in front of the station was a slaughterhouse. 3 of Blackwood's men lay motionless in the dirt, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, their rifles shattered into splinters. A 4th was crawling away, sobbing, his jaw hanging uselessly. Silas Blackwood lay near the porch, his chest caved in, sightless eyes staring at the brutal Utah sun, and in the center of the carnage on his knees was Macklin. He was breathing in ragged, wet gasps. Blood poured from a half-dozen gunshot wounds, his thigh, his shoulder, his side. The iron poker lay bent and discarded in the dirt. He looked up as Joe ran to him, dropping to her knees in the blood-soaked sand. "Macklin!" Joe screamed, tearing at her skirt to press fabric against the worst of the bleeding in his chest. "Hold on, just hold on!" The giant looked at her, his pale eyes losing their focus, fluttering as the immense blood loss took its toll. He reached up with a trembling, blood-soaked hand, not to push her away, but to gently brush a strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. The picture?" he choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. Joe pulled the wet glass plate from her apron. She held it up to the harsh sunlight. There, captured forever in silver halide, was Silas Blackwood murdering the sheriff. Crisp, clear, undeniable. "It's here," Joe sobbed, pressing her forehead against his massive chest. "It's whole. You did it. You kept it whole." Macklin's lips curved into a faint, exhausted smile. His massive hand fell limply into the dirt. "Told you," he whispered to the wind. "Always. Keep my word." His eyes closed, and the giant fell silent. In the distance, over the ridge, The shrill mechanical whistle of a steam train pierced the desert air, accompanied by the sight of 20 federal marshals riding hard on horseback, answering the telegraph's desperate call. They were too late for the fight, but they were in time for the truth. 8 months later. The gas lights of the Boston Athenaeum Gallery cast a warm golden glow over the high society elite. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in silk gowns murmured politely, holding crystal glasses of champagne as they moved from frame to frame. In the center of the gallery hung the exhibition's masterpiece, a massive, enlarged photograph titled Justice in the Dust. It showed Silas Blackwood, the gun, the murdered sheriff. It was raw, brutal, and utterly captivated the East Coast. Josephine Abbott stood near the back of the room, wearing a simple, elegant dark blue dress that felt entirely alien on her skin. She had done it. She had exposed the corruption, brought down a criminal empire, and cemented her name as one of the premier photographers of her generation. Men of wealth and power were clamoring to meet her, to shake the hand of the brave woman who survived the West. But Jo found she couldn't breathe. The perfume was too thick. The chatter was too meaningless. She set her champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray and quietly slipped out the side door into the cool, damp alley behind the gallery. She closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of rain on cobblestones, trying to remember the smell of red dust and dry wind. You never did like crowds. Jo's eyes snapped open. Stepping out from the shadows of the alley was a mountain of a man. He was wearing a remarkably well-tailored suit that clearly struggled to contain his massive shoulders. He leaned heavily on a silver-tipped oak cane, his left leg stiff, but his back was as straight as a California redwood. "Macklin?" Jo breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. He stepped under the glow of the gas street lamp. His face was still a map of scars, but his pale eyes were bright, alive, and entirely focused on her. The federal doctors had pulled 6 bullets out of him. It had taken him months to learn to walk again, months of agony, but he had fought death with the same stubborn, brutal determination he had fought Blackwood's gang. "Read in the papers you were exhibiting the photo," Macklin rumbled, his voice wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "Thought I'd come, make sure no one tried to steal it." Jo laughed, a wet, joyous sound that shattered the polite silence of the Boston night. She didn't care about her elegant dress. She didn't care about the high society inside. She ran across the cobblestones and threw her arms around the giant's neck. Macklin dropped his cane. It clattered against the stone. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her off the ground, burying his face in her hair. He held her with the careful, reverent strength of a man who knew exactly how fragile and precious the world could be. "I'm going back," Jo whispered fiercely against his neck. "Tomorrow, taking the train back to the territories. I have my cameras. I want to photograph the Yellowstone, the Tetons, all of it." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "I need a guide, Macklin, someone who knows the dark, someone who keeps their promises." Macklin smiled, a genuine, beautiful expression that erased the monster entirely. He set her gently back on her feet, picking up his cane. "Well, Miss Abbott," the giant said, offering her his arm, "I hear the Yellowstone is treacherous this time of year. You're going to need a big shadow to keep you safe." Jo took his arm, holding on tight. They turned away from the glowing windows of the Boston Gallery, walking slowly down the cobblestone street, heading back toward the setting sun and the wild, open promise of the West. The Yellowstone territory was not merely a landscape, it was a living, breathing, angry beast. It hissed through fissures in the earth, belching columns of scalding white steam into the crisp autumn air. It smelled of sulfur and ancient boiling mud. To the civilized men of the East, it was a mythological hellscape. To Josephine Abbott, it was the most magnificent studio God had ever created. "Hold the reflector steady, Macklin. The light is shifting behind the caldera." Jo's voice was muffled beneath the heavy black velvet of her focusing cloth. Her hands worked with practiced mechanical grace, adjusting the brass knobs of the heavy mahogany camera. She was attempting to capture the ethereal, terrifying beauty of a deep, emerald-green thermal pool surrounded by a crust of stark white silica. 10 feet to her left, standing precariously near the edge of the fragile, hollow-sounding earth, stood Macklin. He did not look like the man in the tailored Boston suit anymore. The West had reclaimed him. He wore a heavy wool coat, leather suspenders, and a battered Stetson pulled low over his pale eyes. In his right hand, he held a large canvas reflector to bounce the pale afternoon sun onto the bubbling water. In his left, he gripped a thick, gnarly staff carved from a dead lodgepole pine. It had replaced the silver-tipped cane. The Boston cane was for polite society. The pine staff was for survival. "The wind is changing, Josephine." Macklin's deep, gravelly voice cut through the hiss of the escaping steam. "It's bringing the sulfur back. You have 2 minutes before the steam clouds the lens entirely." "1 minute is all I need." Jo pulled her head out from under the cloth, her cheeks flushed, a smudge of soot across her nose. She smiled at him, a bright, unrestrained expression that always managed to make the giant's chest tighten. She slid the fragile glass plate holder into the back of the camera and pulled the dark slide. "Stand still," she commanded the boiling earth. She squeezed the pneumatic bulb. The shutter clicked with a satisfying snap. "Got it." Jo immediately slid the dark slide back in, securing the image. "That's going to be the centerpiece of the new collection. The colors. If only the plate could capture the colors." Macklin lowered the reflector and leaned heavily on his staff. He watched her pack the fragile plate away with the tenderness he usually reserved for her. It had been nearly a year since the bloody confrontation at the Black Ridge telegraph station. A year of physical therapy, of excruciating pain as the shredded muscles in his legs slowly knitted back together around the federal surgeon's silver pins. He would never walk without a limp again. He could no longer run like a coursing hound, nor could he dodge a fist with the supernatural speed that had made him the Denver behemoth. He was a broken giant, but watching Jo meticulously pack her gear, the wind whipping her loose hair around her face, he knew he was the wealthiest broken man on the continent. "Let's move off this crust," Macklin grunted, shifting his weight. The movement sent a sharp, familiar spike of agony shooting up his thigh. He masked it instantly, his face turning to stone. "The ground sounds hollow here. I don't trust a mountain that boils." Jo paused, closing her satchel. She looked at him, her sharp eyes catching the slight tightening of his jaw. She didn't offer pity. He hated pity. But she moved with deliberate speed, breaking down the heavy wooden tripod herself instead of waiting for him to do it. "Camp is just a mile back down the tree line," Jo said, shouldering her satchel. "I'll carry the tripod today. The light is making me energetic." Macklin frowned, stepping forward to take the heavy wood. "I am the guide, Miss Abbott. Carrying the burdens is what you pay me for." "I stopped paying you 6 months ago, Macklin," Jo retorted with a wry smile, refusing to yield the tripod. "You're my partner now, and a partner knows when the other needs to keep their hands free to use that walking stick, or the Winchester." He couldn't argue with her logic, and he certainly couldn't argue with the fierce affection in her eyes. He let her carry the tripod, taking the lead as they navigated the treacherous, steaming terrain back toward the safety of the dense pine forest. Their camp was a small, efficient haven nestled between 3 massive boulders that blocked the biting northern wind. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and bloody oranges, a small fire was crackling merrily. Jo sat on a fallen log, meticulously cleaning the lenses of her camera with a scrap of fine silk. Macklin sat across the fire, a tin cup of black coffee steaming in his massive hands. He had his stiff legs stretched out toward the warmth of the flames, rubbing the thigh muscle absent-mindedly. "Does it hurt worse in the cold?" Jo asked softly, not looking up from her lens. Macklin stopped rubbing. "It's just a dull ache. The cold makes the joints stiff, that's all." "You're a terrible liar for a man who used to make a living deceiving opponents in the ring." Joe carefully placed the lens in its velvet-lined box and looked across the fire. "You don't have to hide the pain from me, Macklin. I was there when the bullets went in. I helped stitch you up before the marshals arrived. I know what it cost you to walk these trails." Macklin stared into the fire, the dancing flames reflecting in his pale eyes. "A man is supposed to be useful, Josephine. If I can't protect you, if I can't carry the weight, then what am I doing out here? The wilderness doesn't care about past glories. It only cares about what you can endure today." Joe stood up, walked around the fire, and sat down on the dirt directly beside him. She reached out, placing her small, calloused hand over his massive, scarred one that rested on his knee. "You aren't my pack mule, Macklin, and I don't need a bodyguard to fight an army anymore." She leaned her head against his massive shoulder. "I need the man who promised to keep me in the light. The man who knows the shape of my soul better than anyone. Your strength isn't just in your fists, it's in here." She tapped his chest right over his heart. Macklin let out a long, ragged breath. He turned his hand over, tangling his thick, battered fingers with hers. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You make it very hard for a monster to wallow in his misery," he murmured into her skin. "That's the entire point of my existence," Joe smiled, closing her eyes as the warmth of the fire and his body seeped into her bones. But the peaceful quiet of the Yellowstone night was a fragile illusion. Macklin's body suddenly went rigid. The tender moment evaporated instantly. His hand released hers, dropping smoothly to the heavy Colt revolver resting on his hip. He didn't draw it, but his thumb brushed the hammer. "What is it?" Joe whispered, her own survival instincts, honed in the Utah desert, flaring to life. "Listen," Macklin said, his voice dropping to a subsonic rumble. Joe strained her ears. Beyond the crackle of their fire and the distant rhythmic hiss of a geyser, she heard it. It was a low, mournful sound, followed by the heavy, chaotic snapping of branches. It wasn't the graceful movement of an elk. It was frantic, desperate. Then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a high-powered rifle echoed through the valley. It wasn't a hunter's clean shot. It was followed by two more in rapid succession. "Buffalo runners," Macklin growled, his face hardening into stone. "Or poachers. The military was supposed to have cleared them out of the park boundaries." "At night?" Joe asked, her blood running cold. "Who hunts at night?" "Men who don't want to be seen," Macklin said, grabbing his pine staff and hauling himself to his feet. "And men who don't want to be seen don't take kindly to finding a photographer's camp in their territory." He looked down at Joe, the behemoth waking up behind his eyes. "Pack the plates. Don't worry about the tent. Just the camera, the glass, and the horses. We are leaving. Now." The forest was pitch black, illuminated only by the pale sliver of a crescent moon. Joe and Macklin moved like ghosts through the dense timber, leading their two pack horses by the reins. Macklin's limp was pronounced in the dark, the uneven ground jarring his ruined leg with every step, but he moved with a terrifying, silent urgency. Joe followed his broad back, one hand gripping the reins, the other resting on the heavy leather satchel containing her life's work. The smell hit them before they saw the carnage. It was the thick, metallic stench of fresh blood mixed with the foul odor of ruptured intestines. Macklin held up a fist. Joe stopped instantly. They had crested a small ridge overlooking a moonlit clearing. Below them lay a nightmare. Over 24 bison, magnificent shaggy beasts that were the symbol of the untamed West, lay slaughtered in the tall grass. Men with lanterns were moving among the carcasses, quickly and brutally skinning the animals, leaving the meat to rot. It was an industrial massacre fueled by the Eastern demand for buffalo robes. "Butchers," Joe whispered in horror, her grip tightening on her satchel. "Keep your voice down," Macklin breathed, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the camp. "There are 6 of them. Heavy rifles. We swing wide to the east, stick to the geothermal basin. They won't track us over the fragile crust in the dark." Joe nodded. She hated leaving the slaughter unpunished, but she knew the math of survival. A cripple and a photographer against 6 armed poachers were odds even the behemoth couldn't beat. They turned to back away. Snap! Joe's horse, spooked by the overpowering smell of blood, shifted its weight and brought a heavy hoof down on a dry, hollow log. The sound cracked like a pistol shot in the silent night. Down in the clearing, the lanterns instantly stopped moving. "Who's up there?" a rough voice shouted from the dark. The unmistakable sound of a lever-action rifle being racked echoed up the hill. "I see horses. Spread out. Don't let 'em run." "Ride," Macklin snarled, abandoning stealth. He hoisted Joe into the saddle of her mare with one fluid motion, disregarding the pain in his leg. He swung onto his own gelding, kicking the beast into a frantic gallop. They tore through the forest, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, the poachers shouted, mounting their own horses. The poachers knew the terrain. They were unburdened by heavy camera equipment and driven by the fear of the hangman's noose if their illegal operation was exposed. "They're gaining, Macklin!" Joe shouted over the thunder of hooves, looking back to see the swinging lanterns cutting through the trees. "Hold on!" Macklin roared. He veered his horse sharply to the left, breaking out of the tree line and onto a vast, barren plain bathed in moonlight. It was the geothermal basin. The ground here was not soil. It was a fragile, chalky white crust of silica, punctuated by bubbling pools of boiling acid, hissing steam vents, and bottomless, scalding geysers. It was a minefield built by nature. Macklin slowed his horse to a careful trot. He couldn't gallop here. One wrong step and a horse's leg would punch through the crust into boiling water, dooming both beast and rider. He used his pine staff to tap the ground ahead of his horse, reading the resonance of the earth like a blind man reading Braille. "Follow exactly in my tracks, Josephine. Do not deviate an inch." They picked their way through the mist. The air was suffocatingly hot and smelled of brimstone. The steam rising from the vents created a surreal, ghostly fog that obscured the moon. Behind them, the poachers burst from the tree line. "There they are!" the leader yelled. "Shoot the horses! Get that saddlebag!" A bullet whined past Joe's ear, splashing into a pool of bubbling blue liquid to her right. The pool hissed angrily. The poachers, fueled by adrenaline and greed, did not slow down. They spurred their horses directly onto the silica crust, intent on running their prey down. "Fools," Macklin muttered. It happened in an instant. The lead poacher's horse hit a patch of thin crust. The earth simply gave way. The horse screamed, a sound that would haunt Joe for the rest of her life, as its front legs plunged into a hidden, boiling sinkhole. The rider was thrown forward, landing hard on the chalky surface, screaming in agony as scalding steam blasted his face. The other poachers hauled back on their reins in panic. Chaos erupted as horses reared and men shouted. "Keep moving," Macklin ordered, not looking back. They reached a narrow land bridge flanked by two massive churning calderas. The water inside boiled violently, sending thick plumes of white steam into the air. It was a bottleneck. Macklin stopped his horse and dismounted, grabbing his Winchester from the scabbard. "What are you doing?" Joe cried, pulling her horse to a halt. "We have to keep going." "They've regrouped. They've left their horses and are coming on foot. They're lighter. They'll catch us before we clear the basin." Macklin limped to the center of the narrow land bridge, turning to face the pursuing lanterns. He levered around into the chamber. "I have to hold the bridge." "You can't fight 5 men in a shootout, Macklin. There's no cover." "I don't need cover. I have the Devil's Cauldron." He looked at her, his pale eyes entirely calm in the face of death. "Ride, Josephine. Protect the plates. If I don't make it to the rendezvous at the North Gate by tomorrow night, keep going." Joe looked at the giant man, standing alone in the mist, ready to sacrifice himself again. The terror that had gripped her vanished, replaced by a cold, burning fury. She was not the same terrified woman in the Utah desert. She was Josephine Abbott. She dismounted. "I told you," Joe said, her voice shaking but resolute as she pulled her heavy leather satchel from the saddle. "We are partners." Macklin turned, his eyes widening in rare shock. "Josephine, get back on that horse." "Shut up and trust me, Macklin." She dropped to her knees behind him, tearing open her satchel. She didn't reach for a gun. She reached for a large tin canister of magnesium flash powder, a thick coil of magnesium ribbon, and her flint striker. Footsteps crunched on the silica crust. 4 men emerged from the steam, rifles raised. The leader, a massive man with a thick, greasy beard, grinned maliciously when he saw them trapped on the bridge. "Nowhere left to run, cripple," the leader spat. "Hand over whatever you got in those bags and we'll make it quick." "Step onto this bridge and you burn," Macklin said, raising his Winchester to his shoulder. "You got 1 rifle, we got 4. The leader raised his weapon. "Fire! Now!" Joe screamed. She had piled a massive mound of the highly volatile flash powder directly on a thermal vent just behind Macklin's legs. She struck the flint. The spark caught the magnesium ribbon, which burned with a blindingly fast hiss straight into the mound of powder. The resulting explosion was not just a flash. It was a miniature sun. The magnesium ignited with a brilliant, retina-searing white light that instantly turned the pitch-black basin into high noon. But the true weapon was the thermal vent. The explosive heat of the magnesium instantly superheated the steam trapped beneath the crust. The vent erupted. A geyser of boiling water, mud, and blinding white light blasted 20 feet into the air, creating a solid wall of scalding fury between Macklin and the Poachers. The Poachers screamed, dropping their rifles to claw at their blinded eyes. The wall of boiling mud rained down on the crust inches from their boots. The sheer concussive force of the eruption knocked the leader backward, slipping on the wet silica. He fell, sliding toward the edge of the boiling caldera. Macklin didn't hesitate. Despite his ruined leg, the behemoth lunged forward. He didn't use a gun. He swung his heavy pine staff in a brutal, sweeping arc. The thick wood caught the flailing leader solidly in the chest, stopping his momentum just inches before he tipped backward into the boiling abyss. Macklin stood over the terrified, blinded man, the staff pressing against his throat. "Crawl away!" Macklin roared, his voice louder than the hissing geyser. "Crawl back to the woods and run! If I ever see your faces in this park again, I will not stop you from falling into the fire." The Poachers didn't need to be told twice. Blind, burned, and terrified of the giant who commanded the boiling earth, they scrambled backward on their hands and knees, dragging their leader with them, fleeing into the steam-filled darkness. Macklin stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, the staff trembling in his hands. Slowly, the adrenaline faded, leaving the agonizing, throbbing reality of his injured leg. He swayed, his knee buckling. Joe was there before he hit the ground. She caught his massive weight, straining against him, easing him down onto the warm, dry crust away from the vent. "You idiot," she breathed, her hands frantically checking him for bullet wounds. Finding none, she slumped against his chest, her heart hammering against his ribs. "You beautiful, reckless idiot." Macklin let out a rough, exhausted laugh, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her soot-stained hair. The smell of magnesium smoke mixed with the sulfur of the earth. But to him, it was the sweetest perfume in the world. "I didn't hold the bridge," Macklin whispered, his voice full of profound awe. "You did." Joe pulled back, framing his scarred, magnificent face in her small hands. The moon finally broke through the steam clouds, casting a silver light over them. "I told you," she said, leaning in until her lips brushed against his. "I know how to control the light, and you know how to fight the dark. We're going to be just fine, Macklin." He kissed her then, not a kiss of desperation, but a kiss of absolute, undeniable certainty. It was a promise sealed not in the terrifying darkness of a collapsed cave, but out in the open air, amidst the fire and boiling earth of the wild Yellowstone. They had survived the crucible, and as they held each other on the edge of the Devil's Cauldron, the giant cowboy knew that for the rest of his days, as long as he had breath in his lungs and strength in his hands, he would walk through hell itself just to carry her camera. The town of Gardner, Montana, clung to the northern edge of the Yellowstone territory like a barnacle to a ship's hull. It was a rough-hewn settlement of timber and mud, populated by trappers, miners, outlaws hiding from federal warrants, and merchants eager to fleece them all. As the biting winds of late November began to howl down from the Absaroka Range, carrying the first heavy promises of winter snow, the town smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and cheap whiskey. Josephine Abbott and Big Macklin rode down the muddy main thoroughfare, their pack horses laden with the triumphs of the past 2 months. Nestled securely in reinforced leather panniers were dozens of exposed glass plates, the boiling cauldrons, the petrified forests, and the vast, untamed herds of the Yellowstone. Jo rode with her head held high, the biting cold bringing a sharp, rosy flush to her cheeks. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had survived the poachers, they had survived the elements, and they had captured the impossible. Beside her, Macklin rode in silence, his massive shoulders hunched against the wind. His heavy wool coat was buttoned tight, and his battered Stetson was pulled low. He looked like just another weary frontiersman, save for his sheer, terrifying size and the thick pine staff strapped to his saddle. His bad leg ached with a deep, pulsing throb in the freezing temperature, a stark reminder of the bullets he had taken in the Utah desert. But he didn't complain. He rarely did. "We'll secure a room at the boarding house," Jo said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "Then we need to get these plates to the Railway Express office. The publisher in Boston is expecting them before the passes freeze over." "Boarding house first," Macklin rumbled, his pale eyes scanning the rough faces lining the wooden boardwalks. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of violence, were prickling. "Town's too crowded for this late in the season." He was right. Gardner was usually emptying out by now, the sensible men fleeing to warmer, lower altitudes. But the saloons were overflowing. Horses were tied 3 deep at the hitching posts, and a restless electric energy buzzed in the muddy streets. They secured a room at a relatively clean establishment run by a stern-faced widow, unloaded their precious cargo, and locked the heavy oak door. Jo immediately set about cataloging her plate boxes, her fingers moving with delicate precision. Macklin, however, remained by the window, peering through a crack in the frost-rimmed glass down at the street below. "Something is wrong," Macklin said quietly. Jo paused, looking up from her ledger. "The poachers? You think they followed us?" "No. Poachers hide. These men are gathering." He turned away from the window, leaning heavily on his staff. "I'm going down to the telegraph office to secure our freight tickets. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone. Macklin, I can go with you." "No." His voice brokered no argument. The behemoth was looking out from behind his eyes, cold and protective. "Stay with the plates." He slipped out into the hallway. Jo listened to his heavy, uneven footsteps fade down the stairs, a sudden knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Down in the street, the cold bit through Macklin's coat, but he barely felt it. He navigated the muddy boardwalk, his massive frame forcing heavily bearded miners and rowdy cowboys to step aside. He reached the freight and telegraph office, pushing open the door to find it crowded with men. But it wasn't the men that made Macklin freeze. It was the broadside poster nailed to the wall behind the clerk's desk. It was freshly printed, the black ink stark against the cheap yellow paper. It depicted a crude, exaggerated drawing of a giant man with bare fists, standing over a broken opponent. "The return of the behemoth, the undefeated king of the bare-knuckle ring. A challenge to all comers. $1,000 to the man who can drop him. Tonight at the Old Livery, sponsored by Diamond Jack Corcoran." Macklin's blood ran ice cold. He stared at the poster, his chest tightening as if a steel band had been wrapped around his ribs. "Looking at the main event, stranger?" Macklin turned slowly. Leaning against the counter was a man in a beaver pelt coat and a silk bowler hat, puffing on a thick cigar. He had a face like a ferret, and eyes that calculated the price of everything they looked upon. Diamond Jack Corcoran. Corcoran was the most ruthless fight promoter west of the Mississippi. He was the man who had bought Macklin's contract out of a mining camp 5 years ago, the man who had turned him from a desperate laborer into a caged animal, bleeding for the amusement of the wealthy and the wicked. Corcoran. Macklin said, his voice a dangerous low gravel. Corcoran grinned around his cigar, exposing a row of gold-capped teeth. I knew it was you when my boys spotted that giant silhouette riding into town. The limp is new, though. Heard you took some lead in Utah playing hero for a lady with a camera. Take the posters down, Jack. I don't fight anymore. Now, Mac, don't be hasty. Corcoran stepped closer, flanked by two massive thugs with flattened noses and cauliflower ears. You broke my heart when you disappeared. Cost me a fortune in canceled bouts. I've been looking for you, and when I heard the famous Josephine Abbott was heading to Yellowstone, I figured her giant shadow wouldn't be far behind. I am not a fighter. Macklin's hand drifted instinctively toward his Colt, but he forced his fingers to stay open. A shootout in a crowded office would only bring the law, and Corcoran owned the law in towns like this. You're whatever I say you are, Mac. You still owe me a fight on your contract. Corcoran blew a cloud of acrid smoke into the space between them. I've got a new boy, a butcher from Chicago. Fast, mean, likes to break bones. The crowd has come from 50 miles around to see if he can slay the legendary behemoth. Not my problem. Macklin turned to the clerk, dropping a gold coin on the counter. 2 freight tickets on the morning train, Boston. The clerk looked at the coin, then nervously up at Corcoran. Corcoran gave a subtle shake of his head. The clerk pushed the coin back. Sorry, mister. Trains are fully booked. Freight cars, too. Might be a week before we can move anything out. Macklin's jaw clenched. Corcoran had bought the station. Here's the deal, Mac, Corcoran said, his voice dropping the veneer of friendliness. You fight my Chicago boy tonight. 3 rounds. If you win, you get the grand, and your pretty lady gets her glass pictures on the morning train. If you refuse... Corcoran smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. Well, glass is awfully fragile, isn't it? Be a shame if a fire started at that boarding house tonight. A tragic accident. The sheer, overwhelming urge to reach out and crush Corcoran's throat surged through Macklin. The monster inside him, the one Joe had begged him to bury, clawed at the walls of his mind, begging to be let loose. He could kill Corcoran right now. He could kill the 2 thugs. But there were a dozen other men in the room. He couldn't kill them all before someone got a shot off. And if he died, Joe was alone, trapped in a town owned by a man who saw her as nothing more than leverage. Macklin looked at his scarred hands, the hands that had held Joe in the dark, the hands that had promised to protect her light. 3 rounds, Macklin whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I fight, and the woman and her equipment are untouched, guaranteed safe passage. You have my word as a gentleman, Corcoran beamed, though the word was a mockery on his lips. Tonight, midnight, at the livery. Don't be late, behemoth. Macklin walked out of the office, the winter wind biting into his face. He felt physically sick. He had sworn to Joe he was done with the blood. Done with the cheering crowds paying to watch men destroy each other. But the frontier was a cruel master, and it always demanded a toll. When he returned to the room, Joe was waiting, pacing the floor. She took one look at his face and stopped dead. What happened? She asked, her voice tight. Did you get the tickets? Macklin leaned his staff against the wall and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. He stared at the floorboards. The train is delayed. We leave tomorrow morning. Joe frowned, walking over and kneeling in front of him. She took his massive, cold hands in hers. You're lying to me, Macklin. I can see it in your eyes. The ghost is back. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bear to see the disappointment he knew would follow. An old acquaintance is in town. He runs the freight lines here. I had to negotiate a price for our passage. Joe's eyes narrowed. She had spent the last year observing the subtle shifts in this giant man. She saw the tension in his massive shoulders, the way he deliberately avoided her gaze. Who is it? Joe demanded. And what is the price? It doesn't matter, Josephine. It's handled. Just stay in this room tonight with the door locked. Macklin! Joe stood up, her voice rising in panic and anger. We are partners. We don't keep secrets. Tell me! He finally looked up, his pale eyes filled with a profound, suffocating sorrow. Corcoran, my old promoter. He has the town locked down. He threatened the plates, Joe. He threatened you. Macklin swallowed hard, the admission physically painful. I have to fight tonight. One last match. Joe felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered the scars on his chest, the brutal, misshapen knuckles, the stories he had told her in the desert of crushing men until they didn't get up. No, she breathed. No, Macklin, you promised. Your leg, it's held together by silver pins. If a fighter targets it, you could be crippled permanently, or worse. If I don't, Corcoran will destroy everything you've worked for. He'll burn this place to the ground. Macklin reached out, gently cupping her face. I can take a beating, Josephine. I know how to survive a ring. I just have to last 3 rounds. It's extortion! We'll go to the local marshal. Corcoran pays the marshal. There is no law here tonight, Joe. Only the ring. He stood up, towering over her, his expression resolute. Lock the door. Do not follow me. He picked up his staff and walked out, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. Jo stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the sturdy leather panniers containing her life's work. They were priceless. They were her legacy. But they were nothing compared to the man who had just walked out to bleed for them. She wasn't going to cower in a room. She was Josephine Abbott. She didn't hide from the dark. She exposed it. She moved to her equipment, her hands flying with desperate speed. She didn't pack her large format landscape camera. She grabbed her smaller handheld reflex camera, a recent prototype she had acquired in Boston, designed for faster exposures. She loaded it with her most sensitive plates. Then she grabbed 2 heavy canisters of her explosive magnesium flash powder. If Corcoran wanted a spectacle, she was going to give him one he would never forget. The old livery stable at the edge of Gardner was a cathedral of vice. The stalls had been torn out to make room for a raised, sawdust-covered ring surrounded by thick rope. The air was a suffocating miasma of cigar smoke, cheap sweat, spilled beer, and the metallic coppery scent of anticipation. 500 men were packed into the barn, screaming, betting, waving fists full of dirty greenbacks. In the center of the ring stood the Chicago butcher. He was a slab of terrifying muscle, younger than Macklin, with a shaved head and a face completely devoid of empathy. He paced the ring like a starving wolf, slamming his taped fists together. The crowd erupted into a deafening, bloodthirsty roar as Macklin stepped through the ropes. He had stripped to the waist, the cold air raising goosebumps over his map of scars. He didn't wear the traditional taped wrists of a fighter. He fought entirely bare-handed. He moved slowly, deliberately favoring his stiff right leg. Standing at the edge of the ring was Jack Corcoran, chomping on a cigar, a pocket watch gleaming in his hand. He leaned over the ropes, smirking at Macklin. 3 rounds, behemoth, Corcoran sneered, or until one of you stops breathing. Give the boys a show. There was no referee. There was no bell. Corcoran simply dropped a white handkerchief into the sawdust, and the violence began. The butcher didn't circle. He charged. He saw the limp instantly and launched a brutal low kick aimed directly at Macklin's surgically repaired thigh. Macklin pivoted with agonizing slowness, taking the blow on his muscular calf instead of the joint. The impact sent a shockwave of pain up his spine, but he gritted his teeth and countered with a heavy left jab. It struck the butcher's jaw with the sound of a meat mallet hitting a steak. The younger man stumbled back, eyes widening in shock at the sheer concussive power of the giant. But the butcher was fast. He ducked under Macklin's next swing and drove 2 vicious, piston-like punches into Macklin's ribs. Macklin gasped, the breath driven from his lungs. He retreated, trying to keep his distance, but his leg betrayed him. He couldn't dance, he couldn't weave, he was a stationary target in a cage. For the next 10 minutes, the barn became an arena of slaughter. Macklin fought with pure defensive desperation. He used his massive forearms to block the flurry of strikes aimed at his head, but his torso became a bruised, bleeding canvas. The crowd roared with every drop of blood that hit the sawdust. They didn't want to see a defense. They wanted to see the legend fall. By the end of the second round, Macklin's left eye was swollen shut. Blood poured from a deep gash above his brow, blinding his right. His bad leg was trembling so violently it threatened to collapse under his weight. He leaned against the ropes, his chest heaving, spitting blood onto the floor. Across the ring, the butcher was breathing hard, but he was grinning. He knew he had the giant broken. "Finish him!" Corcoran screamed from the sidelines, waving a fistful of cash. "Break his damn leg!" Macklin looked out at the sea of screaming, distorted faces. This was the monster's world. This was the darkness he had sworn to leave behind. He felt the ancient, familiar rage boiling up from the depths of his soul. If he let it out, if he became the behemoth entirely, he could kill the butcher. He could snap the man's neck with one twist of his massive hands. But if he did that, he would lose Joe. He would break the promise he made to himself to be a man, not a beast. He pushed off the ropes, raising his heavy, bruised fists, resolving to just survive the final round. At the back of the livery, hidden in the shadows of the rafters near the hayloft, Josephine Abbott steadied her breathing. She had slipped in through a side window, climbing the rotting wooden beams with a quiet desperation. From her vantage point, she looked down directly at the ring. When she saw Macklin, battered, bleeding, his magnificent body subjected to the cruelty of the mob, a tear cut through the dust on her cheek. But she didn't cry out. She didn't panic. She went to work. She set her reflex camera on a sturdy crossbeam, pointing the lens down at the ring. But her main focus was the two heavy tin canisters of magnesium powder. She poured them entirely into a long, shallow tin trough she had found in the loft, placing it precariously on the edge of the beam, directly over the center of the ring. She ran a long fuse of magnesium ribbon from the trough down to her hiding spot. Down below, the third round began. The butcher lunged, feinting high and then dropping low, launching his full body weight into a tackle aimed squarely at Macklin's ruined knee. Macklin couldn't move in time. The butcher hit the joint. A sickening pop echoed over the roar of the crowd. Macklin roared in absolute agony, a sound that shook the dust from the rafters. He collapsed to one knee in the sawdust. The crowd went feral. Corcoran laughed hysterically. The butcher stood over the kneeling giant, pulling his arm back to deliver a crushing executioner's blow to the back of Macklin's neck. Up in the rafters, Joe struck her flint. The spark caught the ribbon. The flame raced up the wood with a furious hiss. Just as the butcher threw his punch, the trough of magnesium powder ignited. It was not a normal camera flash. It was an apocalyptic explosion of pure, blinding white light inside the dark, smoky barn. It was as if a piece of the sun had materialized directly above the ring. The entire livery was instantly illuminated in stark, blinding relief. 500 men screamed in unison as their dark-adjusted retinas were burned by the brilliant magnesium flare. The butcher, looking directly up at the light as he swung, went completely, temporarily blind. His punch missed Macklin entirely, hitting empty air. Click! Joe triggered the shutter of her camera in the split second of maximum illumination, capturing the entire scene. The blinded crowd, the stunned butcher, and Jack Corcoran with a look of absolute terror on his ferret face. Down in the ring, Macklin was the only one who hadn't been blinded. He'd been looking down at the sawdust in pain. When the light erupted, his survival instincts took over. He didn't unleash the monster. He used the discipline of a survivor. Ignoring the screaming agony in his leg, Macklin pushed off his good foot. He rose from his knee like a rising mountain. The butcher was stumbling backward, clawing at his eyes. Macklin stepped into his guard, rotated his massive hips, and delivered a single perfectly executed right cross directly to the butcher's jaw. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a surgical strike designed to shut off the brain. The butcher's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the sawdust like a felled oak. He didn't move. The blinding light faded into a thick, choking cloud of white magnesium smoke. The crowd was in absolute chaos, men stumbling over each other, cursing, rubbing their weeping eyes. Macklin stood over the unconscious butcher, his chest heaving, his fists unclenched. He looked up into the smoky rafters, a bloody, exhausted smile breaking across his ruined face. He knew exactly who controlled the light. Corcoran, his eyes streaming with tears, blindly drew a derringer from his coat pocket, aiming vaguely at the giant silhouette in the ring. "I'll kill you! You ruined the fight!" Before Corcoran could cock the hammer, a voice rang out from the loft, amplified by the high ceiling. "Drop the gun, Corcoran!" Jo stood at the edge of the loft, leaning over the railing. She held her camera in one hand, the glass plate holder highly visible in the other. "I have your picture, Jack Corcoran," Jo shouted, her voice echoing with fierce authority. "I have you holding a gun on an unarmed man in an illegal prize fight. I have the faces of every man in this room. This plate goes to the federal marshals in Salt Lake tomorrow, and to every newspaper on the East Coast by next week." Corcoran froze, squinting up at the blurry figure of the woman. The threat of violence he could handle, the threat of a federal investigation fueled by undeniable photographic proof printed in the Boston papers, was a death sentence to his empire. "You're bluffing, bitch," Corcoran yelled, though his hand shook. "Try me," Jo dared him, her voice cold as ice. "Macklin won the fight. We are leaving. If a single one of your men follows us, if our freight is delayed by even an hour, this plate goes to the governor." The barn was eerily silent now, save for the groans of the recovering crowd. Corcoran looked at the massive, bloody giant in the ring, then up at the fearless woman with the camera. He lowered the gun. He knew he was beaten. "Let them go," Corcoran spat, wiping soot from his face. "Get out of my town." Macklin didn't wait. He ducked through the ropes. He didn't bother to collect his winnings. The money was soaked in blood he didn't want. He limped heavily toward the back exit, the crowd parting for him in silent, awed reverence. Jo scrambled down the ladder from the loft, meeting him at the back door. When Macklin saw her, his tough exterior finally cracked. He slumped against the door frame, the adrenaline leaving him entirely. Jo caught him, wrapping her arms around his bloody, sweaty waist, bearing as much of his weight as she could. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely, tears finally spilling over as she saw the extent of his injuries. "I've got you, you giant fool. You stole my thunder, Josephine," Macklin groaned, a bloody smile on his lips as he leaned heavily on her. "I was supposed to save you. We save each other, Macklin. That's the deal." They stumbled out into the freezing Montana night. The snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick white flakes that landed gently on Macklin's feverish skin, washing away the blood and the dirt of the ring. They didn't go back to the boarding house. They went straight to the rail depot, securing their plates and their horses in a private freight car, locking the heavy iron doors from the inside, just as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. Inside the cold, dark car, surrounded by the smell of hay and leather, Jo worked tirelessly. By the dim light of a kerosene lantern, she cleaned Macklin's wounds, stitching the gash over his eye, binding his bruised ribs, and wrapping his swollen knee with tight, hot compresses. He endured the pain in silence, his pale eyes never leaving her face. When she finally finished, her hands stained with his blood, she collapsed onto a pile of blankets beside him, utterly exhausted. Macklin reached out, his thick, bruised fingers gently brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. "We're going further west," Macklin said quietly, the rhythm of the train beginning to chug beneath them as it pulled out of the station. "Oregon, California, where the ocean meets the rocks. No more running. No more fighting. Just pictures," Jo whispered, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "Just pictures," the giant agreed, wrapping his massive arm around her, pulling her safe against his side. "And you and me." As the train gathered speed, leaving the cruel, violent town of Gardner far behind in the snow, the darkness of the freight car didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary. Because Josephine Abbott knew that no matter how dark the world got, the giant cowboy beside her would always keep his promise to bring her back to the light. And she, in turn, would never let him fight in the shadows again. The Great Northern Railway train hammered its way through the bitter spine of the Bitterroot Mountains, a roaring iron dragon breathing black coal smoke into the pristine, freezing sky. Inside the private freight car, the world was reduced to shadows, the smell of damp straw, and the relentless, hypnotic clack, 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 clack of steel wheels on steel tracks. Josephine Abbott sat cross-legged on a pile of thick woolen horse blankets, a meager kerosene lantern swinging violently from a ceiling hook above her. The golden light danced across the vast, bruised expanse of Macklin's bare chest. He lay on his back, shivering uncontrollably despite the 3 heavy blankets Joe had piled over him. The adrenaline that had sustained the giant through the brutal fight in Gardner had entirely evaporated, leaving his massive body to finally process the catastrophic trauma it had endured. The butcher's blows had cracked ribs and torn muscle, but it was the deep, ragged gash above his eye and the horrific damage to his surgically repaired knee that threatened to take him now. "Cold," Macklin muttered, his head thrashing against the rolled-up saddle Joe had placed beneath his neck. His pale eyes were squeezed shut, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature inside the unheated car. "So cold in the dirt. I know, Macklin. I know. Shh." Joe dipped a torn strip of her petticoat into a tin basin of icy water. She wrung it out and gently pressed the cloth to his burning forehead. His skin was radiating heat like a cast-iron stove. The infection had set in somewhere around the Idaho border. For 3 days and 3 nights, Joe had not slept. She existed in a state of hypervigilance, moving between the small, coal-burning stove at the far end of the car, where she boiled snow for clean water, and the makeshift bed where her giant cowboy fought his private war against death. "Keep the light away," Macklin suddenly groaned, his massive hands blindly reaching up, thick fingers curling into agonizing claws. He was hallucinating, trapped in the memories the fever was dragging up from the darkest corners of his mind. "Don't let them see. Jack, turn off the lights. The blood, too much blood on the sawdust." "Macklin, look at me," Joe said, her voice firm, masking the absolute terror gripping her heart. She grabbed his flailing heavy hand in both of hers, pressing it flat against her own chest so he could feel the steady beating of her heart. "You aren't in the ring. Corcoran isn't here. You are on a train. We are going to the ocean. Remember the ocean?" He didn't hear her. The behemoth was trapped in the cage of his past. He twisted violently, a movement that tore a fresh groan of agony from his throat as his ruined knee shifted. "I didn't mean to," Macklin whispered, the words slurring, tearing at Joe's soul. "He was just a kid from the copper mines. Just a kid wanting a payday. I hit him too hard. Felt his skull give. I tried to stop, God. I tried to pull the punch." The tears spilled over Joe's lower lashes, cutting hot, clean tracks through the soot and dust on her face. This was the monster he feared. Not a beast of malice, but a man broken by the violence he was forced to inflict. The guilt he carried was a poison far more deadly than the infection in his blood. "It wasn't your fault," Joe wept, leaning down until her lips brushed his burning, sweat-slicked ear. "They made you a weapon, Macklin. A weapon doesn't carry the sin. The man who swings it does. You are a good man. You saved me. You kept your promise." She stayed like that for hours, draped over his massive chest, anchoring him to the physical world with her own weight, murmuring reassurances into the dark. She spooned drops of precious water past his cracked lips. When his shivering became violent convulsions, she lay down beside him, wrapping her arms around his torso, using her own body heat to combat the violent chills. On the morning of the 4th day, the rhythmic clatter of the train changed. The steep, grinding ascent gave way to a smoother, faster descent. They had crossed the Cascade Range. Joe woke to the sensation of a heavy, rough thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. She gasped, sitting up quickly. The kerosene lantern had burned out. But harsh, brilliant morning light was pouring through the cracks in the freight car doors. Macklin was awake. His pale eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised flesh, and his face was drawn and hollowed by the fever. But the terrifying glassy sheen of delirium was gone. He looked at her with pure, lucid exhaustion. "You look terrible, Miss Abbott," he rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. Joe let out a wet, choked laugh, pressing her face into his neck, inhaling the smell of sweat, wool, and life. "You have absolutely no room to talk, you giant idiot. Your fever broke." Macklin slowly, painfully, lifted his good arm and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her tight. "I had a dream," he murmured into her hair. "Dreamt I was back in the dark, in the cave in Utah. But I wasn't afraid, because I knew you were going to strike the flint. I'll always strike the flint for you, Macklin." He closed his eyes, a profound peace settling over his battered features. "Where are we?" Joe carefully pulled away, standing up on stiff, aching legs. She walked to the heavy iron door of the freight car. She unlatched the heavy iron bar and pulled the door open just a few inches. The biting, dry cold of the mountains was gone. The air that rushed into the car was cool, damp, and tasted sharply of salt and ancient pines. It was a smell unlike anything Joe had ever experienced in the dry deserts of Utah or the sulphurous valleys of Yellowstone. She pushed the door wider. Below them, a dense, emerald-green forest of towering redwoods and Douglas firs sloped down toward a vast, rolling expanse of slate-gray water. It was the Pacific Ocean. It stretched out to the horizon, endless and untamed, crashing violently against massive, jagged black sea stacks that rose from the surf like the teeth of a drowned god. "Macklin," Joe breathed, utterly captivated by the raw, kinetic power of the coastline. "We're here. We made it to the edge of the world." Macklin shifted, gritting his teeth against the pain as he propped himself up on his elbows to look out the open door. He stared at the vast ocean, a body of water so large it made even a man of his immense size feel appropriately small. For the first time in his life, looking at the crashing waves and the endless horizon, the Denver behemoth felt his shoulders truly drop. The crushing weight of the blood, the crowds, and the constant hyper-vigilant survival of the frontier seemed to wash away in the salty air. "It's loud," Macklin observed quietly, listening to the distant, rhythmic thunder of the surf. "Are you complaining?" Joe asked, looking back at him with a tired, brilliant smile. Macklin laid his head back down, his pale eyes entirely soft. "No, Josephine. For the first time in my life, the noise isn't cheering for blood, it's just water. It's perfect." The coastal town of Cannon Beach was little more than a collection of weathered cedar-shake cabins huddled against the relentless wind of the Oregon coast. It was a place populated by fishermen, loggers, and people who simply wished to be left alone by the relentless march of the industrial East. Spring had arrived, softening the fierce winter storms into a persistent, moody mist that blanketed the towering sea stacks just offshore. On a high bluff overlooking the beach, set back into a protective grove of twisted, wind-blown spruce trees, sat a cabin. It was larger than the others, newly built from thick, honey-colored timber. Attached to the back was a windowless addition built with absolute precision, a sealed, temperature-controlled darkroom. Josephine Abbott stood on the wide front porch, adjusting the brass lens of her camera on its heavy tripod. She was focusing on Haystack Rock, the massive monolith of basalt rising from the surf, currently framed by a dramatic, bruised sky. The salty wind whipped her skirt around her ankles. She was no longer the terrified, desperate woman fleeing through the slot canyons of Utah. She was grounded, confident, and entirely at peace in her element. The heavy thud of an axe burying itself into a block of wood echoed from the side yard. Joe smiled, stepping away from the camera and walking around the porch. Macklin stood shirtless in the crisp sea air, a heavy splitting maul in his massive hands. He brought them all down, splitting a thick round of spruce clean in half with effortless, terrifying power. His body was still a testament to his violent past. The scars across his torso were silver and permanent. He favored his right leg entirely, moving with a heavy, pronounced limp that the cold dampness of the coast sometimes made excruciating. But the hard, brutal edge of his face had softened. The perpetual scowl of the behemoth had been replaced by the quiet, focused contentment of a craftsman. He was using his immense strength not to break men, but to build a life. "If you chop any more wood, we're going to have to build a second shed just to store it," Joe called out, leaning against the porch railing. Macklin drove the maul into the chopping block and wiped the sawdust from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked up at her, his pale eyes catching the soft, diffused coastal light. "A man likes to ensure his wife stays warm when the winter storms roll in off the Pacific," Macklin rumbled, picking up his flannel shirt from a nearby stump and shrugging into it. Wife. The word still sent a warm, profound thrill through Joe's chest. They had found a circuit-riding preacher in Astoria 3 months ago. There was no grand ceremony, no crowds, just the two of them, the preacher and the roaring ocean serving as their witness. Macklin limped over to the porch, ascending the low stairs. He reached out with his thick, calloused fingers, gently tucking a stray lock of wind-blown hair behind Joe's ear. His touch, capable of crushing bone, was lighter than a seagull's feather. "The post rider came down from Astoria while you were in the dark room," Macklin said, pulling a thick, wax-sealed envelope from his shirt pocket. He handed it to her. "It bears the seal of the Boston Athenaeum." Joe's breath hitched. She took the heavy envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. It had been nearly a year since she had mailed the Yellowstone plates, along with the explosive photograph of Jack Corcoran's illegal fight in Gardner, to her publisher. Communication across the continent was agonizingly slow. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick parchment. She read the elegant, sweeping script in silence, her eyes widening with every line. "Well?" Macklin asked quietly, watching her face. "They published them," Joe whispered, the paper shaking in her hands. "All of them. The Yellowstone series was featured in Harper's Weekly. They're calling it a masterclass in frontier documentation." She looked up, tears of disbelief and joy pooling in her eyes. "And the Corcoran photo?" "Macklin, the federal marshals used it. Corcoran is in a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. His entire ring was dismantled. The photo was undeniable." Macklin let out a slow, deep breath, looking out toward the churning gray ocean. A dark, heavy chain that had been wrapped around his soul for 5 years finally, silently, snapped. The monster was truly dead. The men he had hurt, the blood he had spilled, he couldn't erase it. But he had helped drag the architect of that misery into the light. "He's in a cage," Macklin murmured, "where he belongs." "There's a bank draft in here, Macklin," Joe said, looking back down at the letter. "For the exhibition rights. It's more money than I've ever seen in my life. We could buy a house in San Francisco. We could travel to Europe." Macklin looked at her. He didn't see the famous photographer, the toast of Boston high society. He saw the woman who had struck a flint in the dark to save his life, the woman who had washed his blood from the floor of a freezing boxcar. "Do you want to go to San Francisco?" he asked, his voice steady. "Do you want the crowds?" Joe looked at the letter, representing everything she had once dreamed of when she first set out with her camera. Glory, recognition, high society. She looked past the letter to the rugged, untamed beauty of the Oregon coast. She looked at the sturdy cabin they had built with their own hands. And finally, she looked at the giant cowboy standing before her, the man who had walked through hell, taken bullets, and fought demons just to keep a promise. With a decisive motion, Joe folded the letter and tucked it into her apron pocket. "I have already captured the Yellowstone. I have exposed the darkness of the fighting rings," Joe said, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around Macklin's thick waist, resting her head against his chest. "I have no desire to photograph polite society holding champagne glasses. I want to photograph the storms rolling in. I want to photograph the tide pools. I want to stay right here. Macklin's massive arms wrapped around her, holding her secure against the wind. The Pacific is a wild subject, Josephine. It won't stand still for your camera. I know, she smiled against his flannel shirt, but I have an exceptionally steady assistant to hold the tripod. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the underbelly of the clouds in brilliant streaks of magenta and gold, Jo pulled away. The light is perfect, she said, an urgent, excited spark in her eyes. Don't move. She rushed to her camera, throwing the black velvet focusing cloth over her head. But she didn't point the lens out toward Haystack Rock or the crashing waves. She pivoted the heavy wooden tripod, aiming the brass lens directly at the porch. Josephine, Macklin groaned good-naturedly, shifting his weight. I told you I am a terrible subject. I am too big for the frame, and my face breaks the lenses. Stand still, behemoth, or I'll fire my assistant, Jo commanded from beneath the cloth. Underneath the velvet, she looked at the inverted image on the ground glass. Macklin stood on the porch of the home he had built. The harsh, brutal lines of his scarred face were softened by the golden hour light. The wind ruffled his hair. He looked strong, immovable, and incredibly profoundly at peace. He looked like a man who had finally forgiven himself. Jo slid the glass plate holder into the back of the camera. She pulled the dark slide. She didn't need flash powder today. She didn't need explosions or fear. She only needed the natural, dying light of a beautiful day. Look at me, Macklin, Jo said softly, stepping out from beneath the cloth, her hand resting on the pneumatic shutter release. Macklin looked at her. The fierce, terrifying giant who had struck fear into the hearts of men across the territories offered her a smile of pure, unguarded love. Click. The shutter opened and closed. The image was captured, not of violence, not of survival, but of a promise made in the darkest, most terrifying depths of the earth, finally and beautifully fulfilled in the light. The Pacific Ocean did not experience winter. It waged war. For 3 days, a monstrous gale had battered the Oregon coast, hurling walls of slate-gray water against the basalt sea stacks with the concussive force of artillery fire. The wind shrieked through the spruce trees, bending trunks that were thick as whiskey barrels, and driving the freezing rain horizontally across the cliffs. Inside the heavy timber cabin on the bluff, however, the storm was reduced to a dull, rhythmic thud against the reinforced shutters. Josephine Macklin stood in her dark room, bathed in the eerie, blood-red glow of the safe light. The sharp scent of developer fluid and acetic acid masked the smell of the sea salt that had seeped into the wood. With a pair of bamboo tongs, she gently agitated a glass plate in the chemical bath, watching the shadows and highlights slowly materialize like ghosts summoned from the silver halide. It was a portrait she had taken 2 days prior, just before the storm broke. It showed a massive pair of scarred, misshapen hands gently cradling a tiny, perfect, sleeping infant. Jo smiled, her heart swelling until it physically ached against her ribs. She transferred the plate to the fixing bath, wiped her hands on her apron, and pushed open the dark room door. The main cabin was a haven of golden light and warmth. A massive fire roared in the riverstone hearth. Sitting in a custom-built rocking chair large enough to accommodate a grizzly bear was Macklin. He was carving a block of soft cedar with a small draw knife. Nestled securely in the crook of his massive left arm, fast asleep against his chest, was their 1-year-old son, Davies. They had named him after the murdered sheriff in Utah, a tribute to the man whose death had set them on the path to each other. The behemoth, the man who had once terrified mining camps and crushed skulls in sawdust rings, was softly humming a low, off-key lullaby, his chin resting gently on his son's dark hair. "If Corcoran or the butcher could see you now," Jo murmured, walking over and leaning over the back of the rocking chair to press a kiss to Macklin's temple. Macklin stopped carving, a slow, warm smile crinkling the corners of his pale eyes. "If they could see me now, Josephine, they would realize they never knew what true strength looked like." He shifted his weight carefully, protecting his bad leg, which always ached with a dull, grinding fire when the barometric pressure plummeted. Did the plates turn out? Perfectly, Joe said, coming around to sit on the thick bearskin rug at his feet. She rested her hand on his good knee, leaning into his warmth. Though I think Davies is going to be more photogenic than either of us. He already has your stoic stare. Before Macklin could reply, the heavy oak front door shuddered violently, not from the wind, but from a frantic, desperate pounding. Macklin's instincts flared instantly. He didn't reach for a gun. They lived in peace now. But his body tensed, the protective guardian waking up. He gently handed the sleeping infant to Joe, his massive hands incredibly precise. He stood, grabbing his heavy wool coat from the hook by the door, and unlatched the heavy iron crossbar. The door blew open, letting in a shrieking gust of wind, a spray of freezing rain, and Elias Thorne, the local lighthouse keeper. Elias was drenched to the bone, his yellow slicker shining in the firelight, his face pale with terror. "Macklin!" Elias gasped, clutching the doorframe to keep from being blown backward. "I need you! Every able man in Cannon Beach is down at the cove." "What's happened, Elias?" Macklin demanded, his voice a deep, steady anchor in the chaos of the storm. "A coastal freighter!" Elias yelled over the howling wind. "The Iron Star! Her rudder snapped in the gale. The current dragged her right onto the Devil's Tooth Reef. She's breaking apart, Macklin. There are a dozen men clinging to the rigging, and the surf is too violent to launch the lifeboats." Macklin didn't hesitate. "The breeches buoy?" "We fired the Lyle gun and got a line secured to her mast," Elias explained frantically. "But we don't have the manpower. The undertow is too strong. When the waves hit the ship, the tension on the rope drags the men on the beach straight into the surf. We can't hold the line taut enough to pull the rescue chair across the water." Macklin looked back at Joe. She was already on her feet, holding little Davies tight against her chest. She saw the question in her husband's pale eyes. It wasn't a question of whether he should go. It was a silent acknowledgement of the danger. He had retired his fists, but the sea was asking for his strength. "Go," Joe said fiercely. "Go, Macklin. Bring them home." Macklin nodded once. He grabbed a thick coil of heavy manila rope from the corner of the room, slinging it over his broad shoulder, and pulled his battered Stetson low over his eyes. He followed Elias out into the maelstrom, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Joe stood in the quiet cabin for exactly 10 seconds. She looked down at her sleeping son. She carried him into the bedroom, placing him gently in his sturdy crib, and pulled the heavy quilt up to his chin. Then, Josephine Abbott Macklin walked to her equipment corner. She didn't pack her heavy landscape camera. She grabbed her brass-bound, handheld reflex camera, wrapping it tightly in a waxed canvas sack to protect it from the rain. She grabbed 2 massive sealed tins of magnesium flash powder and her flint striker. Her husband was walking into the dark to fight a monster far older and more powerful than any man in a boxing ring. She was going to make sure he didn't fight in the shadows. When Joe reached the bluffs overlooking the cove, the scene below was a vision from Dante's Inferno. The Iron Star was impaled on a massive, jagged spire of black basalt 100 yards offshore. The surf was apocalyptic. Waves the size of 2-story buildings crashed over the deck, sending plumes of freezing white spray 50 feet into the air. Through the gloom, Joe could just make out the dark shapes of sailors clinging desperately to the shattered remnants of the mainmast. Down on the black sand beach, a dozen local men were fighting a losing battle. They were hauling on a thick hawser rope that stretched over the boiling surf to the doomed ship. Attached to the rope was the breeches buoy, a life ring with canvas trousers sewn into it, designed to haul men across the water one by one. But the ocean was too strong. As a massive swell hit the ship, the mast pitched wildly. The violent tension on the rope jerked the men on the beach forward, dragging them through the wet sand toward the deadly undertow. "Hold her! Dig in!" Elias screamed, slipping in the mud. They couldn't. The rope began to slip through their bleeding hands. The breeches buoy, carrying a terrified, freezing sailor halfway across the gap, dipped dangerously close to the churning, freezing water. Then, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the cliffs. Macklin didn't run to the end of the line. He marched directly into the freezing surf, the water immediately swirling around his knees. "Macklin, what are you doing?" Elias screamed. "The undertow will take you." Macklin ignored him. He waded to the front of the line of struggling men. He grabbed the thick hawser rope with his massive, scarred hands. But he didn't just pull. He took the excess line and wrapped it entirely around his own waist and over his broad shoulders, using his immense body as a human cleat. He widened his stance, driving his heavy boots deep into the wet, packed sand until the water rushed over his shins. "Pull!" Macklin roared. It was the voice of the behemoth, but unleashed not in anger but in absolute defiant salvation. The men behind him hauled. Macklin leaned back, taking the full, brutal kinetic force of the Pacific Ocean directly onto his own spine. Crack! The rope snapped taut, vibrating like a violin string under thousands of pounds of pressure. The heavy canvas coat Macklin wore groaned in protest. His surgically repaired leg screamed in agony as the undertow tried to rip his footing away. But the giant did not move. He was a mountain of muscle, bone, and iron will. He had stopped the line from slipping. "Haul the buoy!" Macklin bellowed over the crashing waves. With Macklin acting as an immovable anchor, the other men frantically pulled the retrieval line. The breeches buoy, carrying the first soaked, shivering sailor, cleared the surf and was dragged safely onto the beach. Up on the bluff, Jo fought through the wind and rain, setting up her equipment under the dubious shelter of a rocky overhang. Her fingers were numb, but they moved with the muscle memory of a master. She poured an enormous mound of magnesium powder onto a flat rock. Down below, the process repeated. A second sailor, a third, a fourth. For 2 hours, Macklin stood in the freezing surf. Every time a wave crashed into the iron star, the violent shock wave traveled down the rope, threatening to snap him in half. The coarse manila rope dug through his heavy coat, biting into his shoulders and chest, opening old scars. By the time the 9th man was hauled ashore, Macklin was visibly failing. He was shivering violently, his face pale and drawn. His bad leg was buckling, the muscles cramping under the impossible strain. "Only 3 left," Elias shouted, his voice hoarse. "Hold on, Macklin, just a little longer." Out on the reef, a wave larger than any before it, a rogue leviathan of black water, rose from the deep. It blotted out the horizon. It crested, curling with terrifying lethal grace, and slammed directly into the shattered hull of the Iron Star. The sound of twisting iron and splintering wood was deafening. The ship lurched violently, tearing off the reef and beginning to roll over into the deep water. The sudden, catastrophic shift in weight put an unimaginable strain on the hawser rope. The men on the beach were instantly yanked off their feet, thrown forward into the sand. Only Macklin remained standing. He roared in agony as the rope wrapped around his body threatened to crush his ribs. He was being dragged forward, his boots plowing deep trenches in the black sand. The freezing surf rushed up to his waist, trying to pull him under. If he let go, the rope would snap, and the last 3 men on the ship would be dragged into the abyss. Up on the cliff, Jo saw him falter. She saw the ocean trying to claim the man she loved. "No!" Jo screamed into the wind. She didn't reach for her camera. She grabbed her flint striker and slammed it against the steel. The spark caught. The massive pile of magnesium powder ignited. It was an explosion of light so brilliant, so absolute, that for a single staggering second, it turned the apocalyptic midnight storm into high noon. The blinding white flash illuminated every drop of rain, every cresting wave, and the desperate, brutal struggle on the beach below. The sudden, impossible daylight shocked the struggling men on the beach out of their panic. Down in the surf, Macklin saw the flash. He knew exactly what it was. It wasn't just light, it was a beacon. It was his wife standing on the cliff telling him that he was not in the dark. A primal, impossible surge of adrenaline flooded Macklin's exhausted body. He didn't just hold the line, he fought back. He planted his bad leg, ignoring the tearing pain in his knee, and leaned his massive shoulders back against the pull of the dying ship. He dug his boots into the bedrock beneath the sand. "Get up!" Macklin roared to the men in the dirt behind him. "Pull them in!" Driven by the giant's impossible stand, Elias and the fishermen scrambled to their feet. They grabbed the line behind Macklin and hauled with everything they had. Creak, snap, the mast of the Iron Star finally gave way, crashing into the sea. But in the seconds before it fell, the sudden slack allowed the men on the beach to haul the breech's buoy, carrying the final 3 sailors in a tangled, desperate heap over the crashing surf and onto the safety of the sand. The hawser rope went entirely slack. Macklin collapsed. He fell backward into the freezing surf, completely, utterly spent. He didn't care about the cold. He didn't care about the pain. He lay in the shallow water, listening to the coughing, weeping sounds of 12 men who were going to live to see the sunrise. Strong hands grabbed him. Elias and 3 others hauled the giant out of the surf, dragging him up onto the dry sand. "You did it, you crazy bastard," Elias wept, clapping Macklin on his massive, bruised shoulder. "You held it." Macklin didn't answer. He was looking up at the bluffs. Through the driving rain and the fading smoke of the magnesium flash, a figure was sliding and scrambling down the muddy cliff path. Jo hit the beach running. She dropped her canvas-wrapped camera in the sand and threw herself onto Macklin's soaked, battered chest. "I've got you," Jo sobbed, wrapping her arms around his freezing neck, pressing her warm face against his icy cheek. "I'm here. You're safe." Macklin managed a weak, exhausted rumble of a laugh. He wrapped his thick, trembling arms around her, burying his face in her wet hair. The smell of magnesium smoke clung to her clothes, mixing with the salt of the sea. "I told you," Macklin rasped, his voice barely audible over the roaring ocean. "I told you I'd be your monster, if you needed one." "You aren't a monster, Macklin," Jo whispered fiercely, kissing his bruised, salt-stained lips. "You're a guardian. You're my guardian." 2 days later, the storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of scrubbed, brilliant blue and an ocean that rolled with deceptive, sparkling calm. Inside the dark room, Jo gently agitated a fresh glass plate in the developer bath. She held her breath as the image appeared. It was not a posed portrait. It was a photograph taken in the split second of the massive magnesium flash during the height of the storm. The composition was chaotic, blurred by rain and flying sand, but the subject was undeniably clear. In the center of the frame, surrounded by boiling surf and darkness, stood a giant. His heavy coat was pulled tight by the thick rope wrapped around his body. His muscles strained, his face was contorted in a roar of absolute defiance against the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. It was a picture of a man taking the brutal violence he had been taught and turning it into an act of profound, life-saving grace. Jo dried the plate, her heart full, and walked out into the main cabin. Macklin was sitting by the fire. His chest and shoulders were heavily bandaged where the coarse rope had rubbed his skin raw. His bad leg was propped up on a stool, aching but unbroken. In his lap, little Davies was babbling happily, chewing on a smooth piece of driftwood Macklin had carved for him. Jo walked over and handed Macklin the dried glass plate. Macklin held it up to the firelight. He stared at the image of himself for a very long time. For years, whenever he looked in a mirror, he had only seen the behemoth. He had seen the blood on his hands and the ghosts of the men he had hurt. But looking at this photograph, captured by the woman who loved him, illuminated by a flash of light she had made just for him, he finally saw something else. He saw a good man. Macklin lowered the plate and looked up at Jo. His pale eyes were bright with an emotion that had nothing to do with pain. "It's a good picture, Josephine," he said softly. Jo smiled, sitting on the arm of his chair and resting her head against his broad, bandaged shoulder. She watched their son play in the lap of the gentlest giant the world had ever known. "I only photograph the truth, Macklin," she said. "I always have." The story you're about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
This story is, at its core, a profound meditation on redemption, truth, and the transformative power of human connection in a world shaped by violence. Set against the unforgiving landscapes of the American West, where survival often demands brutality, it reveals that even in the harshest environments, the human spirit is capable of choosing light over darkness. Josephine, the photographer, represents the pursuit of truth, fragile, dangerous, yet essential. Her camera is not merely a tool, but a moral force, capturing not only what happened, but what must be remembered. In contrast, Macklin embodies the weight of a violent past, a man shaped into a weapon by circumstance, who believes himself defined by the damage he has done. Yet through his journey, the story challenges that belief. It suggests that identity is not fixed by past actions, but reshaped by present choices. Macklin does not erase his past. Instead, he confronts it, redirects it, and ultimately redeems it by using his strength to protect rather than destroy. One of the most powerful lessons in this story is that true strength is not physical dominance, but restraint, responsibility, and sacrifice. Macklin could have remained the behemoth, feared and unstoppable, but he chooses instead to become a guardian, a protector of life, of truth, and of the woman who sees beyond his scars. His repeated willingness to risk everything for Josephine and for justice illustrates that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Meanwhile, Josephine's role reminds us that courage also takes quieter forms. She does not fight with fists, but with light, with truth, with evidence, with the refusal to look away. Her determination to document reality, even when it endangers her life, reflects a deeper moral principle: that silence in the face of wrongdoing allows darkness to grow. The story also speaks deeply about partnership and mutual salvation. Unlike traditional narratives where one hero rescues another, here both characters save each other repeatedly, physically, emotionally, and morally. Macklin shields Josephine from the dangers of the world, while Josephine rescues Macklin from the darkness within himself. Their relationship illustrates that love is not weakness, but a force that can reshape identity and purpose. It is through her belief in him that Macklin begins to see himself not as a monster, but as a man capable of goodness. And it is through his protection that Josephine is able to carry truth into the world. Together, they represent a balance between strength and compassion, action and meaning. Another key message lies in the idea that truth, once captured and preserved, has the power to outlast violence. The photograph of the murder becomes more powerful than any gun, bringing justice not through revenge, but through exposure. This reinforces a timeless value: that truth, even when fragile, can dismantle corruption and restore order. The story reminds us that justice is not always immediate, but when supported by courage and persistence, it becomes inevitable. Finally, the story offers a deeply human reflection on healing. Macklin's physical scars never disappear. His limp remains. His body carries the memory of pain. Yet he finds peace not by escaping his past, but by building a new life, one defined by love, purpose, and quiet strength. The transition from violence to creation, from breaking bones to building a home, symbolizes the ultimate redemption arc. It tells us that healing is not about forgetting, but about transforming suffering into something meaningful. In the end, this story teaches us that no matter how dark the past or how brutal the world may seem, there is always a choice: to remain a product of that darkness or to rise above it. It reminds us that truth matters, that compassion is powerful, and that even the most broken individuals can find redemption through love, courage, and purpose.